Another mystery from all the way back in A Game of Thrones. Another answer from Moonman. Does Ned Stark have a secret that no one is talking about? And I mean, like, no one. A secret no one cares about. A mystery no one cares about that is considered long answered or not even a mystery. Did Lyanna Stark have a secret? Well, I'm Greg, aka Moonman, and questions about why Lyanna Stark got a statue in the Winterfell Crypts have not been answered to my satisfaction, even if they have been to everyone else's. This is, after all, a Game of Thrones, is it not? It's a political drama, among other things, a tale of intrigue and scheming, perspective and ideology. Okay, the ideology probably won't come into this, but the political intrigue will, from none other than Ned Stark. And, yeah, I mean, that's a prejudice of mine, that this is a political drama. When I see a question, I tend to look for an answer in the politics. And I think that's been fruitful. I think that's what the books are about, in large part. So yeah, the mystery of Lyanna and Brandon's statues in the Winterfell Crypts. I've got an answer, I think. Welcome back to Moon Messages. Thank you so much to the viewers of my videos who've graciously chosen to support my work on Patreon and are listening to this from there. That's the best place to get this new podcast. It's where I'm going to get all the other thoughts and theories about Ice and Fire off my chest while working on the extremely vital political reanalysis that is Stannis, That Peach, and the Battle of Wind on YouTube. Part 3 coming soon. These podcasts will be unscripted and loose. This is episode 2. They'll be easy to produce, not taking, therefore, any time away from the videos. I just have a lot to say on a lot of subjects, Ice and Fire. And so while I'm working on part 3, in the meantime, here I am, hat in hand, begging for your money. Being laid off is great for having time to make YouTube videos, but not much else. And, part 3, which hopefully you're all eagerly awaiting, does require some more original artwork. So consider joining at the $5 players level on Patreon today. Or if that's not your bag, I guess you could go on eBay and buy my childhood Legos. Just built the Caribbean Clipper. Okay, so now back to the half-baked theory here. Lyanna's statue, just a case of Ned's sentiment or guilt or affection manifesting in stone? Well, that's what the 8-year-old thinks. We're going to take his word for it? I think not. Let's see. When he's down the crypts in Bran 7, A Game of Thrones, Bran says, "And there's my grandfather, Lord Rickard, who was beheaded by Mad King Aerys. His daughter Lyanna and his son Brandon are in the tombs beside him. Not me, another Brandon, my father's brother. They're not supposed to have statues. That's only for the lords and kings. But my father loved them so much, he had them done." Oh, well, that's sweet of Ned. But is it bullshit? Was he just covering his ass because he was disinherited? Yeah, I think probably has something to do with that. So we'll talk about that presently. I guess, yeah, the first thing that comes to mind to get out of the way is that, you do see it a lot, slightly misstated that sometimes that only the kings of winter and the lords of Winterfell are buried in the crypts. It's actually very clearly all of the Starks are meant to be buried in the crypts. But as far as the Starks themselves understand it, the statues are only of kings and lords of Winterfell. So the lords get the statues. That's the tradition. Now, of course, that could have mystical origins. It could have mystical importance. The statues, the swords on their laps. But of course, it also has a political dimension as well. And in this case, I guess the politics of feudal legitimacy and succession. Because, if you're one of your first duties, if you're a Stark and you're inheriting Winterfell and the lordship of the North from a deceased family member, one of your first duties is to bury that family member in the crypt and give them a statue of stone. Have the statue carved seemingly in place out of the rock in the tomb, which is interesting. That's another tangent, doesn't matter. And in doing that, in most cases, it doesn't really matter for this purpose because it's going to be taken as read. And obviously, like, if you were somehow unable to recover the body of a Lord of Winterfell, like they sank at sea or something, like no one's going to say, well, hey, you didn't bury your dad, you can't inherit Winterfell. But it is like kind of one last action that affirms that that person was the Lord of Winterfell, right? Because Lords of Winterfell get statues, which could be, in certain cases, important politically. Such a case might be if you're Ned Stark and you're in the Vale, having grown up, spent a lot of your late childhood, mid to late childhood in the Vale, making friends with Robert Baratheon, your buddy, and under the care of Robert Arryn, and you hear that your father and brother have been tortured and murdered by the Mad King Aerys, and you might find people around you possibly looking at you and saying, well, Ned, that's very sad, but also, that means you're the new Lord of Winterfell. Something you never saw coming. Yeah, people may be looking to you, maybe Robert, maybe Jon Arryn, and saying, well, you're the new Lord of Winterfell. But you might be thinking, imagine this, just go with me. Imagine you're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, I see your point. I could very well be in some sense. And if you're telling me I am, then I probably am. That's probably because that's what everyone in the continent assumes, that you would be next in line, which means in a sense you are. I mean, a claim is a claim. It's an argument. I don't mean to quote, I'll quote Varys saying power resides where men believe it resides as an explanation of politics itself, basically. But you don't need that. I mean, I guess you need that if you want to talk about like what George's conception of politics is. It's not really necessary in this case. That is very important to when you're talking about claims in a feudal society. It's like, well, do you have a good argument? Are people willing to back you on it? You can dispute, people will dispute various claims all the time. You may be thinking as Ned, well, yeah, I clearly have a claim because some people clearly believe that I do. But you might also be thinking, but there is other information. And that information, go with me here, could be that Rickard specifically intended to disinherit Ned. Now, I say intended because the best way to disinherit someone would be to do it publicly, just like the best way to declare an heir would be to do it publicly. Because, what would it look like if someone dies and someone who was never mentioned to be the heir and isn't necessarily the obvious choice to be the heir comes out and says, hey, actually, we had a private conversation and he said that I was the heir. That, whether it's true or not, looks identical to everyone in the world. If you're lying, same exact scenario as if it's actually true, which is why if you actually want to like name an heir, you would do it publicly. Now that's the best case scenario. There may be reasons. It's not super clear, for example, how public Rob's declaration of an heir was shortly before his death. He made it before his bannerman, and he wrote it on probably several pieces of paper. But did he do what really a king probably should do and send birds out to the entire continent stating this? It doesn't seem so, and there may be reasons we wouldn't go into that are strategic for that. But, we're talking about best case scenarios, and then there are contingencies and reasons why you might do otherwise. In this case, we'll get to why it might not be public in this case when we talk about why they would do it in the first place. But yeah, imagine you're like, you're Ned, and you're thinking, well, Rickard actually specifically told me I'm being taken out of the line of succession, even though I'm not even next in line, just as a precaution. And if that's the case, if he's going to that trouble, then it would really mean that it's a likelihood that Brandon would be in on that too and also have done the same thing. Because, at that time at least, Brandon dies just before he's supposed to marry Kat, has no legitimate children, so Ned would be his heir, would have the best claim to be his heir. I will be pedantic about this because this is what we're talking about, is the politics of, feudal inheritance here. All politics is contested by definition. So he would have the best claim, of course, as being, his eldest younger brother. Ned as being Brandon's eldest younger brother. So imagine also that Brandon had specifically said, and then if they're going to do this in semi-secret, they probably have it written down, and a few people probably do know. Well, you're thinking, gosh, I'm actually not the Lord of Winterfell. And you might even be thinking someone else actually has also, I should say, yeah, if you're disinheriting Ned, it means if you're going to the trouble of doing that, again, even if it's half-assed, like partially in secret and just written down on paper, you're necessarily, for that to, you're not going to do that without correcting it by naming an heir. And I would submit, Ned might be thinking, yeah, it is written down, and some people may know, or definitely do know, that both Rickard and Brandon's heir, according to them and on paper, and maybe witnessed by a few people, was Lyanna. And thus, she has a good claim. But people around you are saying, well, you're the Lord, and Lyanna has disappeared. That's what has, in part, led to Rickard and Brandon's death, is Lyanna has been taken away by Rhaegar. And you may be thinking, well, dang, she's got a pretty good claim. But you start letting people call you Lord anyway. Now, we don't even know he did that. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter for the point of this. Let's assume he just kind of goes with it, doesn't say much. He doesn't talk a lot anyway. He lets people call him Lord. For all they know, they're never going to see Lyanna again anyway. Important to add here that one might wonder also, like, why would they not leave it to Benjen, which figures into this. Again, it still kind of works either way, but we're just going with one version of this for now. There is, looking this up, I had to answer this question, and I guess there is some entry in World of Ice and Fire that says that he had been intending to join the Night's Watch ever since hearing a recruiting speech at the tourney at Harrenhal, which is interesting. That's an interesting detail to me. Annoying that it's not in the main series. This is like a pet, wistful, not a complaint, not a gripe, just like a wistful longing of mine that that book and really had never been written, and that even Fire and Blood had not been published, because not really a complaint, just like I think the exposition and foreshadowing in the series is such a masterwork that that masterwork is diminished, which is why I haven't really read them yet. Those other ones, I will go to specific places when I'm trying to write the video, to say like, okay, am I fucking anything up here that's like obviously contradicted? But like a lot of my theory is based on a lot of the Battle of Wind theory is based on the exposition of the history of the conquest, Aegon's conquest, which comes up a bit more in part 3. And I didn't come to that by reading Fire and Blood. I came to it by reading the series. That's it. So that's a digression. How did I get there? Damn it. It says that Benjen was already planning to join the Night's Watch. He had made this clear. So if there were conversations like this, and they were saying to Benjen at Winterfell to Benjen, we need to disinherit Ned, Benjen may have said, well, don't look at me. I will, if you disinherit Ned and somehow it comes to me, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to join the Night's Watch. Okay. We'll get to maybe another possibility with him, but let's say that's the case. And so they then would be in a position to say, well, shit, then we really, really specifically need to put down here in writing, yes, my daughter, my sister, obviously being a woman is in this society is going to give you is just a weaker claim. So you're going to want to have put that in writing. Okay. So Ned's thinking Lyanna has a claim here over me in some sense, in that it was the wishes of the dead family members here who otherwise would have inherited or were passing on and otherwise would have inherited. Okay, so, and let's set aside an alternate scenario in which they don't specify that, and it is thus naturally, it would be Benjen who would come in most estimations, despite being younger than Lyanna, in this society would have a better claim because he's a man, probably a much better claim, because that's how the society seems to view it. So, but that's an alternate scenario. It's still relevant. You're Ned. People are calling you Lord throughout the rebellion. Eventually, you find Lyanna. Maybe this is one of the things you talk about with her. Maybe this is part of the promise that she's asking. Promise me, Ned. Maybe, here's another slightly alternate version. Maybe you have no idea that you've been disinherited, but because this was a family meeting you weren't a part of because you were in the Vale, and Lyanna is telling you, hey, we all talked about it. You were disinherited. There are papers. And you're learning about this only now, after having called you Lord all this time throughout the rebellion. And again, yeah, maybe what she's asking as a promise, we'll get back to this, I think, has something to do with that. Now she dies. Lyanna dies. You know, they're out of heirs, right? By their planning. It's hard, you know, what noble feudal family can really have like a roster of heirs 10 deep? Not all of them, and they didn't. And so a bunch of members of this family, Rickard, Brandon, Lyanna, have died in quick succession. And thus all of Rickard's preparations in this scenario for like an heir, even the contingency of Brandon's death, you know, which is prudent before he has children, you know, okay, Lyanna. Okay, well, Lyanna was taken away. So, and now Lyanna is dead, and all that contingency has gone out is useless. So, well, who inherits now? Well, certainly Benjen has a claim, whether he would want it or not. Certainly if it comes out as public or can be made public, that Brandon was Ned was specifically disinherited. If Benjen wanted to and could get this information and people believed it, or enough people could come forward or whatever, if this could be made salient, politically salient, he could use that as part of his claim, saying that they shouldn't, that Ned should not inherit. But of course he doesn't want it. And you could say, well, if he doesn't want it, if it's true that he had already said, well, I'm going to the Night's Watch, and that's what he's telling Ned. But hey, the other scenario that they did, that he was presumed by Rickard and Brandon that Benjen, the other scenario that Benjen was presumed the next heir after Brandon by Rickard and Brandon, that would mean in that scenario, okay, well, Benjen has a claim. Okay. But if you're Ned and you know that there is evidence out there, possibly in the world, that Lyanna was in the wills of both Rickard and Brandon, so whoever died first, it does seem that Brandon died first. We do have that in, I think, 3 accounts, including Jamie, who was there, does not really contradict it. You can imagine scenarios, even the way it's written, that either one of them could have died first, but it does seem like Brandon died first while Lord Rickard's probably still talking and, just being tortured with fire. But you wouldn't necessarily know that as Ned. But either way, or to be sure, because we're talking about ass covering here, but either way, if Rickard and Brandon had left Winterfell to Lyanna, but as a backup, as a just clarification, and Lyanna had not ever had any reason to even privately on paper name an heir, because it's like wild scenario that, she's going to inherit. And it's all just, and the only reason to do so would be to keep it out of Ned's hands, which we'll get into why, but if that's not a huge priority for her, then what does she care? Like, to sign a piece of paper like that. Then all of a sudden, Ned has a very good claim to inherit Winterfell from Lyanna. Even if he was disinherited by Rickard and Brandon, and then in theory, by the logic of these claims, if, theoretically, she didn't practically and no one cared, but if in a line of succession, which is important if you're making or justifying a claim or your legitimacy, if there's a line of succession scenario where Lyanna really inherited Winterfell on the death of Rickard or Brandon, whatever the case may be, and it doesn't really even matter. I mean, they're dying within minutes of each other. It only matters if you have to nitpick this as part of a claim argument. But either way, in this case, if she inherited, if someone can come forward with this information like, well, Ned was disinherited, they never wanted him to inherit, they wanted Lyanna to inherit, well then, she's dead. Ned has an excellent claim to inherit from her as her eldest brother. Unless, she had an heir, a Targaryen heir to Winterfell. Oh, but wait, there must always be a Stark in Winterfell. Uh-oh, Ned. Well, and we will get back to that, of course. But if that being the case, when you show up in Winterfell as Ned to take your seat, and it's time for you to lay the bones of your family to rest in the crypts, the question of inheritance, your inheritance involves the line of succession. And so while the wider public may imagine that, and it's perfectly satisfactory to everyone that you inherited from Lord Rickard or Brandon, either one, because, they basically die at the same time, and who can say? But it doesn't matter either way, as far as most people are concerned. That obviously means Ned Stark has an excellent claim. But if you're worried that out there, sometime, somewhere, someone might challenge that, well, you've got this alternate scenario. But for that to be relevant later down the road, if it needs to be, you need to cover your ass and you need to live out that political program. And, much like I talk about Stannis needing to publicly project a certain political program, and in his rhetoric and deeds, Ned may stick to the rhetoric of his inheritance from Rickard and Brandon, but he can at the same time cover his ass in case anyone ever brings this up by building a statue of Lyanna in the crypts, such that if this is ever relevant, he can say, well, yes, that's right. I inherited from Lady Lyanna of Winterfell, the Lady of Winterfell, who inherited from Rickard or Brandon, whichever. And his cover story is that he just did it out of sentimentality because he missed them and wanted to honor them again, but having in his back pocket the ability to say, well, yes, actually my legitimate inheritance of Winterfell came through Lady Lyanna of Winterfell, and throw a statue of Brandon in there to reinforce, to not make to not make it seem like he's leaving Brandon out. Like there's any, if you're breaking this family tradition and making a statue for Lyanna, it would be like you're deliberately not doing that for your brother. They both died tragically around the same time. And that both is both good for the cover story of that it's just a case of sentimental affection, and it's also ass covering in the line of succession because you as Ned don't really know someone. There's it would be a dumb argument and a dumb claim, but if there's ever any question of like, well, no, actually, the document actually Brandon really would have inherited after Rickard's death because he actually died 15 minutes later, and he actually didn't leave it to Lyanna. Like, you're just covering your ass in for every possible scenario and inheriting. And hey, if it's not true that, and hey, also if it's not true that was always planning to go off to the Night's Watch, maybe you sent him there to prevent him from making a claim because yours is on weak footing. Sneaky Ned. So that was a good first half. Coming up in the second, why would they disinherit him? That's a big obvious one. There's a lot to talk about there. Then other questions like why keep it a secret? We mentioned we'd bring that back. Stuff to do with Lyanna, her promise, her kid, how that would fit in. Other Benjen questions. Maybe some loose ends about like Brandon dying first and what that means exactly. So if you want to hear the rest, head over to patreon.com/moonmantheories, probably that $5 tier. All right.